Say happy birthday, happy anniversary to everyone out there. It sounds like some of us or some of you know Elizabeth Preach. She is with Midcoast Family Services, and she's the director of residential services. And I've had the pleasure to work with Elizabeth in the past. So she will be talking about domestic violence today. So I will hand it over to her.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to get the PowerPoint set up here. And I know my laptop has a slight delay, so just bear with me just a second as I get that. But thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited. Okay, I hope did it share? Does it say domestic violence and children?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, let me just get it in presentation mode, which again, there's just going to be a slight delay while it decides it's ready for that, and then we will really get going. Yay, there it goes. Okay, so this is a brief overview of what we're going to visit about today, like just some definitions and then some dynamics, like why it's hard for people to get out of domestic violence relationships. And while we talk, I am going to probably usually refer to victims as maybe female or she and perpetrators as male or he, but I do want to recognize that domestic violence could occur between any genders in relationships, you know, same-sex relationships as well, or that even a female can even be harmful to a male. And then we're going to look at some statistics, of course, but then why those statistics are important, and then time for questions also. And before we jump in fully, I did want to, of course, thank you for what you do, because as you may have guessed from some of our pre-lunch chat, I'm also a foster parent, and I've had the pleasure of having one of you, Miss Linda, for a CASA for one of my kids. And I think the most valuable part for my kids when they do get a CASA is just having somebody that likes them, you know, because often foster kids, they're pulled from an abusive home, that they have difficult behaviors at school maybe, but you guys just get to like them and love them, and that's so needed. So thank you. And also that I wanted to mention that domestic violence is a rather tough topic, and we know the statistics of it affects about 1/4 of all women and 1 in 7 men. And so I have, you know, no doubts that this might be personal for you or someone in your family. And so, of course, if you need to visit more about anything that's more personal, we can certainly do that after, or our hotline is always open for you also. So these are the types of domestic violence that we're going to go over today. It's not a complete list, like there are other types such as abusing somebody through either technology by stalking them online or controlling their technology, and there's stalking itself, which is actually really its whole own topic. But these were the ones I thought of that you might see most often or that might come up in the work you do. So these were the ones I wanted to focus on. And financial abuse is one that you might not think of right off the bat, but I wanted to include it because, as you can see, the National Network to End Domestic Violence tells us that it occurs in almost all domestic violence cases. So I thought it was really important to highlight it. And what we see really often is something like they'll buy a car, but they'll put it only in her name, and then he refuses to make payments, so he's ruining her credit. Or even identity theft, where he's making all these big purchases in her name. And what we see also really commonly is, even though maybe she has her own job, we've got someone who's controlling both people's finances or keeping a really close eye on that bank account and monitoring every purchase. And if we think about it a little bit, a reason for doing that, if all that's going on, that's something that keeps somebody trapped in a dangerous relationship like that. Like if somebody's looking at all my purchases, it's very difficult for me to maybe plan ahead for a hotel room or get bus tickets to a different city, or maybe I'm even buying luggage or things like that. Like, you know, making those plans to leave often involves money. And so that's just a factor that keeps people trapped there. And then on the other end of that, we see a lot where a batterer doesn't want the victim to get a job or doesn't want them to get an education. And that one, sometimes it looks nice, right? Like, so he might say something like, oh, you don't need to get a job, I'm going to take care of us. Or really, you should stay home with the kids. Nobody's going to do a better job taking care of them than you are. Like, you don't need to go to work, just take care of our kids. Or same with education. You don't need to get an education, I'm going to take care of us. So it looks really, really kind. But if I don't have a good job, I can't set aside my resources to get out of this relationship. If I don't have an education, I'm not going to be able to get a higher paying job and be independent. So these things cut off a person's independence. Now, emotional abuse, you guys are probably familiar with, and you probably see that with your kids too. We've got the more obvious types of emotional abuse, like name calling and insults or belittling somebody. But what we also see fairly commonly is the abuser is accusing her of cheating on him, even though there's no basis for that. It's just this constant accusations. You're cheating on me. You're not faithful. And I'm not sure why that occurs, but it's a common thing. And what also is really, really common is he'll say, well, if you leave me, then I'm just going to have to end my life. My life isn't worth it without you. And of all the times I've seen that said, I've never seen a batterer actually follow through with that. And sometimes that's comforting from our side to be able to tell people that, like, actually, that's a really common tactic. That's something he's saying to try to get you to stay. And even if he were to do that, that wouldn't be your fault, right? A person should be able to either seek counseling for what they need. Like, that's not on another person if that were to happen. But if that is occurring, something that would actually be more likely to happen is he harms her or kills her and then kills himself. That is more common than just him harming himself only. And then we do see quite a bit of controlling what someone wears or who they talk to. And those are kind of power dynamics to sort of prove who's really in charge in the relationship. And some of those things may look kind also, even though they're not. Like, oh, where's that pretty skirt I bought you? Why don't you go put that on? Or I really love it when you wear makeup. Like, where's your makeup? Or even the other way, like, why are you wearing makeup like that? Other men gonna think that you want them. But it's not about that, right? Everybody gets to make their own choices for how they express themselves through their clothes and such. And as far as who they talk to, you might see something that looks more like, I don't like your sister because she doesn't like me. Like, you don't need to be talking to your sister. Or you don't need to be talking to that friend because she doesn't like me. Or your mom's always talking bad about me, so I don't like her. And again, all of this goes back to what they're doing. The abuser is sort of cutting off all of those exit routes. Because if I've stopped talking to my sister because he doesn't like her or we think she doesn't like him, then I'm not going to feel as comfortable going to my sister and saying, hey, I need help getting out of this relationship, or disclosing to her what's really going on. And again, I just want to reiterate, so much of this is kind of dressed up as a wolf in sheep's clothing, so to speak. Sometimes it looks so nice, but it's methods of control. Now, psychological abuse, sometimes people get this confused with the emotional side of things, but they are actually pretty distinctly different. Emotional abuse is a lot more obvious, and the psychological abuse is the mind games. And many of you may have experienced some stuff like this. It's the difficult to describe stuff, and it's the stuff where when the victims start telling you about it, they follow it up with, I know this sounds crazy, or I know that doesn't make sense. But if you know these signs, it does make sense and it doesn't sound crazy at all. And one of the tactics is the abuser might portray that victim to others as crazy. If he keeps doing that, then who is going to believe her when she does try to speak out about what's really going on? And we see a lot where any decision is the wrong decision. Like, she could have made spaghetti for dinner or she could have made chicken. It doesn't matter. He's going to have a complaint about it. Minimizing those hurtful things. Like, there are things that we are rightfully upset about, that hurt our feelings, that are rude. But when someone kind of comes behind it and acts like, well, why would you be upset about that? Then it makes us doubt, well, maybe I shouldn't be. Maybe I am the crazy one. Maybe I am emotional or overreacting. Or sometimes they'll just flat out deny it, not just minimizing it, but like, that never happened. I had a woman on the hotline recently tell me she had started recording their conversations just to prove to herself that she was not crazy, that he really was saying and doing these things. And sometimes it really does get that drastic or that extreme, is making a person doubt their own reality. And these things, if you're not aware that it's a manipulation tactic, these are the things that really wear you down, and kind of get rid of that self-worth and just make you feel powerless in a situation. So that's why this one is so rough. And again, we have things that look very, very nice, but feel very wrong. For example, I don't know if anybody has seen on Netflix, there's a documentary called Surviving R. Kelly, who was music person a while back. But in that documentary, his ex-wife starts talking about how one day he showed up and he surprised her with a wedding, and he had gone to all this trouble. He had this big extravagant plans. He invited all these people, and he surprised her with this wedding. And on one hand, like, that looks, I mean, like, oh, he put on all this work, it looks really romantic, but at the same time, like, who surprises somebody with a wedding, right? A wedding is something where two people have agreed on that and agreed to be married. And she describes that feeling of she couldn't place it, but like, it looked so nice and she felt like she should be so grateful, and she couldn't figure it out, but it just felt so wrong. And if it's okay if I share a sort of more personal story, a similar story to that is I had a friend who used to do all these manipulation tactics. It was awful, and it took me years to realize it. But I had a birthday, and I had said what I wanted to do for this birthday and where I wanted to go. And instead, she planned a whole different thing, a whole different place, whole different weekend. And then my birthday became all about her. And I had those same experiences that the woman described about R. Kelly. I thought, well, this is really kind. I should be really grateful for this. This is nice. She's planned all this. But the thing is, I had already said what I wanted to do for my birthday. And it was the same experience of, it's so nice, but something's weird about this. And so I feel like in those moments, what that's sort of conveying to the victim of that situation is that, what I want for you is more important than what you want for you. Like, you don't have an actual voice here. Like, I'm really, you are just sort of a plaything in my life, really. And so that's why psychological abuse is really rough. Physical abuse, again, y'all are probably really familiar with most of this. There's of course, the actual physical violence, like hitting or slapping, punching, and then stabbing and shooting. More often than you'd think, we see people who use a car to try to hurt someone. Either they're legitimately trying to run over the person with a car, or they're getting out of the car and they take off and try to drag that person. There's also the intimidation tactics of like throwing objects near the victim, or like destroying property near the victim as sort of intimidating, being like, well, look what I could do to you. And something you might not have thought about before is like denying medications or the basic needs like food and water and things like that. If they're diabetic, sort of like hiding insulin and things. And I have had a woman, she was actually, it was a case of sex trafficking, but it was a boyfriend. Y'all know how that goes. And she felt like he was putting roach poison in her water, or even drugging her water. And I fully believe that is probably what was happening. And then there's suffocation and strangulation. Now, strangulation, I want to highlight really briefly. It is sort of its own topic, but the reason I want to highlight strangulation is because it's the #1 predictor of a domestic violence homicide. And it's been extensively studied recently. And the deal is, it used to be fairly minimized, because if you compare how strangulation looks to how a slap looks, like they both just leave a little red mark, right? And the red mark is gone within a few minutes. And so people were kind of comparing the severity the same way, like, oh, it's just like a slap, it's nothing, nothing's broken, it's no big deal. However, strangulation can kill someone within minutes. And it's a very personal act, which I'll talk about in just a minute more, but the statistics also show us that it's basically practicing for homicide. So these statistics are also from all from the Texas Council on Family Violence, and they have found that women who have been strangled are 7 times more likely to be killed by that person. I mean, that's kind of a lot, 7 times. And in 2018, 43%, so that's nearly half of the women who were killed in Texas by their partners, they had been strangled in the year leading up to it. And even as a mode of death, it's usually the 3rd leading cause of domestic violence death in Texas. And I would have put always the third leading cause, but you know how it is saying always, but pretty much generally any year, the first leading cause is guns. They shoot her, and then it's stabbing and followed by strangulation. So it is a really serious thing. It's so serious that it's even a question on our intake forms. It's its own whole question. And I never phrase it as, did he strangle you? Because some people don't know what that means, or some people call it choking. Instead, I say, did he ever put his hands around your neck or anything else around your neck? And that gets a firmer yes or no. And if the answer is yes, then I talk about how this is really a red flag and how I'm so glad that she came into the shelter and didn't stay with him, just because that really is an indicator that he's getting ready to kill her. And I say that not to scare her, but more of as I'm glad you left, and let's really work to keep you continue to stay safe. So just so that you know that too. And people who strangle are mostly men, and I think that women who strangle are actually strangling their children. So you might look out for that too. Now here's what I talked about, it being really a whole different personal crime. So if you think about someone who's breaking into your house and you're defending your house and yourself, and your options are shoot, stab, or strangle, what are you going to choose? Obviously, most of us with mentally healthy people are going to choose to shoot the person if we're capable of those, and we have to, because you can do it from across the room. It's very impersonal. It keeps you safe. Like it's that would just be most people's first choice. Second choice would be stabbing, of course, because you have to get up a lot closer, but still, you can kind of keep yourself safe, and still nobody's enjoying these things, right? And then lastly, if we really had to, would be like, okay, I mean, I guess I could, still, I was probably still trying to be hitting somebody. I wouldn't be strangling them. But people who strangle, they enjoy that. They would choose that first. They asked these men who killed their partners that way, they said, would you have rather shot or stabbed if it had come to it? And all of them said no. Like they enjoyed that sensation of watching her die, which is really disturbing. But I feel like it's info that should be out there. And further info, nearly all the mass shooters, those mass shootings and people who kill law enforcement have a history of strangling their intimate partners. And all this information, you can find it on the Strangulation Training Institute, which has a lengthy training. And then Kelsey McKay, she used to work for the district attorney in Travis County, which is Austin, but now she's doing well enough that she's like an independent consultant or something. And then the first guy to study this, his name is Casey Gwinn, and he was over in California. And side note, the reason they started studying it was because they had 2 domestic violence homicides pretty close together, and they were very horrific, and both of them were teenagers. And they said it really would be nice if we knew what the major warning sign was so that we could prevent the homicides. And so they were the ones that looked through the homicides and found out that strangulation was the warning sign that's leading up to those homicides. So I'm glad they did that. Moving on to sexual abuse. Now, this is one y'all may not have considered in the context of domestic violence. And again, it's one that's more recently being studied, but there's actually a huge amount of overlap between physical and sexual violence if that context is there within a relationship. And there is marital rape, which is just rape, exactly what it sounds like, but there's also sabotaging birth control and demeaning someone sexually, and those accusations of infidelity that we talked about. I've seen men that are asking that woman to have babies until she gets a boy. And again, so some of these things are okay if both people are consenting. If both people want to have a boy and they want to keep having babies until there's a boy, then okay. But the case I'm thinking about, it was really unhealthy for that woman to be pregnant. He wasn't like even letting her go to the doctor for her pregnancy checkups. Like it was just a really horrible situation, and just another way to control her, of course. Something else that you might see is asking the victim to have sex with others for money or drugs, and that is what sex trafficking is, just so you're clear. Or even asking the victim to participate in making or selling of porn or things like that. So a cycle of violence. Now, if all these terrible things are going on, we like to think that we would get out of that relationship, right? But the thing is, just like with your CASA kids, things were not always bad. Like there were good days with mom and dad, right? And there are good days with all abusers where they remember your birthday and they're so sweet to you. They're sober, right? There are these good days. And those are the days that keep victims in these bad relationships. And those are the days that keep your CASA kids loving their birth parents, right? And they've actually labeled this cycle. So there's like the honeymoon phase, where he's making all these promises. Oh, it'll never happen again. I'm so sorry. You mean the world to me. What would I do without you? And then there's this tension building phase. And that's where people feel like they're walking on eggshells, right? The dinner isn't right no matter what it is. Like, why did you buy that? I didn't say you could buy that. Why are you wearing that? You look like you're trying to get other men. Until finally it erupts in some sort of physical or sexual violence or some other big attack. And then, of course, then the apologies start again. It'll never happen again. And the cycle continues. And so what I like to tell people is you cannot wait for it to always be bad. If you wait for it to always be bad, you will never leave. And I compare it to a good relationship. And so I'll do that with you now. Like, think of a good relationship you have, whether it's romantic or it's your sister or your best friend or something. It's probably not stellar every single day of the year, right? You've had a fight with your friend, you've disagreed with your sister about politics. So even a good relationship is not always good, in the same way that a bad relationship isn't always bad. So you've got to look at whether you're on the healthy spectrum or the unhealthy spectrum. And this in general is kind of a progression of the domestic violence itself. Like every single domestic violence relationship starts out really happy. In fact, a little too happy. If that's a warning sign. If your relationship is moving too fast, if it's going too well, if you feel like this person is different than anyone you've ever dated before and you've just connected so well so quickly, that's actually a warning sign that things are going to get bad later on. So I've said some of this already. Oh, and so you guys are probably familiar with grooming, of course, with talk of sexual abuse, how with a child, especially in a non-family sexual abuse, say it's the soccer coach or something, right? The coach doesn't set out to molest the child the first day, right? First, maybe it's a little pat on the head, and then maybe there's some weird hugs, and you know how it progresses like that, and happens so slowly. The same thing with domestic violence. Like, abusers don't jump straight to horrible behavior. That's how they hook you in. First, they're very nice, and they're creating that loyalty and that dependence. But also, we as good mentally healthy people, we like to see the best in people, and we remember when things were good or who that person can be. And oh my goodness, I've seen so many people who want to fix that person, to which I always respond like, hey, it's not your responsibility to fix that person. Like, it is his responsibility to fix himself, just like it's my responsibility for myself and your responsibility for yourself. That's not us to go fix people and make them not abusers. Sometimes people will blame drugs and alcohol, like, oh, when he's sober, he's so nice. But actually, studies have shown that while drugs and alcohol do enhance abuse and make it worse, that even if you make that person sober, they're still abusers. They're more using that as excuses to abuse, if that makes sense. But it's not like because of the drugs or alcohol. I hope nobody's afraid of frogs. Sorry, I put this picture on there. But a great metaphor is the frog in boiling water. And so I will say the metaphor just in case you're not familiar. So there's this idea that if you put a frog in boiling water, please don't, that it will feel the heat and it'll jump out right away. But that if you put a frog in room temperature water and slowly raise the temperature, that the frog actually will just chill out in there and boil to death, because it will not sense the danger that's coming or the rising temperature. Again, that's all. Please don't do that. I'm sure it's true though. And I feel like that's the perfect metaphor for domestic violence, because again, if somebody were to slap us the first time we met them or on a date or something, obviously we would get out of there really quickly and block that person on all our social media and stuff. But that's just not how the violence works, in the same way that that's not how child sexual abuse works either. So some more reasons she doesn't leave. So these are kind of the more practical reasons, like maybe only one of them has income or the car, or what will their family or friends think? And like, that's an interesting dynamic. I'm younger, but I have a couple friends who are a couple who are thinking of getting a divorce. And I did think the other day, I'm like, well, my gosh, do I stay friends with both of them? Is that weird? Do I need to take a side? And that's my first experience with that. But that must be what they're thinking too. Like, which one of us is going to be friends with Elizabeth, or can we both be? Or there's some views out there, of course, that marriage is for life, or what will my family think? I'll be maybe shunned or something like that. Or maybe my friends are going to take his side even. Maybe my friends believe everything he's been saying about me all these months. They're obviously, of course, worried about those custody arrangements for the kids, or, you know, she's never going to see her kids again. That's a common fear. Keeping the pets safe. As a side note, that's why we have a pet kennel at the shelter. If everybody remembers the hurricane, of course, people stay behind to stay with their pets, right? Or I take my pets with me. I would never leave my pets in a hurricane. And the same thing with domestic violence. Like, they know they're leaving danger, and they know they're not going to be there to protect the pets. So it's either a reason they stay, or you know, it's a worry they have. And so that's why we have the pet kennel, so that it's not A, to keep the pets safe, and B, so it won't be a barrier to people leaving. And I can think of, I think, 3 cases where I actually do know of where he killed the pets after she left. That, I mean, that's a common thing. He'll retaliate in that way by killing the pets, which I hate. And so some of the reasons she might not leave, like, he might use immigration status against her if she's undocumented, or I saw this one over the summer, they're involved in criminal activity together, so he can easily turn her in if she leaves. You know, he can hold that over her head. She may have nowhere to go. It might be as simple as that. And that's another reason domestic violence shelters exist. The other reason domestic violence shelters exist is because leaving a relationship like this is the most dangerous and deadly time. Meaning that's the most likely time that the victim is actually going to be killed, is when she tries to get out of that relationship. Because he senses the loss of control, and gets that mindset, if I can't have you, nobody can have you. And that's when we get those homicides, unfortunately. So that's why domestic violence shelters exist, and why almost all of them have so much security and stuff, and like why we don't share where we are and things like that. And why we accept people 24/7, any type of emergency like that. Okay, so of course she's worried how he's going to retaliate if she leaves. And y'all, denial and minimization is a survival skill. It is not possible for us to compute that this person who loves me also abuses me. And so maybe she's sitting here thinking things aren't that bad. Like, I know this is a little rough, but it's okay. Like, I can handle it. I know him. He would never do this. Because it really, again, our brains are here to protect us. And our brain will not let us think like, wow, I could be killed any day in my own home, because that's just not a way we're able to live. And of course, she does love him, right? Victims do love their abusers. This is potentially someone they've been together for years. This is the most important person in her life. They see each other daily. And every time they talk about this, they feel such shame about it. Like, they're like, I know he's this, done all these terrible things, and I just can't help it. I love him. And I always say, well, yeah, of course you do. Like, that's someone you're in a relationship with. That's someone who's very important to you. And we try to separate out like the behavior from this person that she loved, and saying, but this behavior is not safe for you. That's why we're not staying in this relationship, because this behavior isn't safe. But it's totally okay that you still love him, and things like that. Same thing with your kids, of course. And so we're really careful. We don't ever trash talk and abuse her or anything like that. We just keep it focused on her safety and the behavior, again, not the person. So let's move on to domestic violence in children. And so these are the kind of the main things I thought of. Like, we've got children who are witnessing abuse. To me, that is still actually abuse, though. But there's also direct child abuse as directly being hit or something like that. And then as kids get older, they do start intervening in the domestic violence, which is incredibly dangerous, of course. And some of you, what you guys might see is that teen dating violence. So Honoring Texas Victims is an annual report that's done by the Texas Council on Family Violence. And what they do is put out a summary of every single individual that has been killed by domestic violence in the past year in Texas. And so until actually this most recent year, they focused only on women, but this past year they did focus on men and same-sex couples, which is great. I mean, they should be. It's 2020. And so these are the numbers from that report, but you can look up reports all the way to the 80s on the website if you really want to see it. And it's really neat because they give us the statistics, like that's where we get that strangulation info. That's where we get the info that they get killed when they're trying to leave the relationship. And that's where they're studying all that info to try to figure out how to prevent these deaths. But in addition to all that info, they also put a nice little summary. Well, actually, it's really morbid because the summaries are about how the death occurred rather than like a nice eulogy to the person, but they are about how the death occurred. So you can read those too, unfortunately. But again, relevant to y'all, in 2018, 290 Texas children had a parent that were killed by domestic violence, and 83 of those kids actually witnessed their mom being killed back in 2013. So, child witnesses. All this information is from childwitnesstoviolence.org if you want to look up any more of this. So they said that at least a third of American children have witnessed violence between their parents, most of them multiple times. And between 3 and 10 million children, depending on the study, will witness domestic violence, this year, each year. And so the majority of children who live in homes with domestic violence, they have seen the violence. Now, the reason that's relevant is because I do hear a lot of moms who just insist that the kids knew nothing about the domestic violence, nothing happened. And I think there's two reasons for that. I think one is they're afraid that we're going to call CPS or something. And I think the other reason is that, I've been a mom. I want to believe that nothing bad is happening to my kids. I'm going to feel a lot of shame if I feel like something, I have maybe feel responsible for putting my kids at risk or having to witness these terrible things. And so I think part of it is just a little bit of denial. And so these next two statistics kind of highlight that same sentiment. Over a third of children in one study reported seeing violence used by their dads against their moms when a parent reported that no violence occurred. And years ago, I was doing a similar presentation to this one, and I remember looking it up, and the statistic was so high, and I'm gonna say it even though I can't cite it because it was so shocking to me, but it reiterates the same thing. The statistic I found at the time said they asked the victims, the adult victims separately and the kids separately, and said they asked, did the kids know about the domestic violence? And it was high. It said 90% of the victims, the parents said no, the kids knew nothing about it. And an equally high percent, again, it was as high as 90% of the kids were like, actually, yeah, we did know, we knew what was going on. And that's always the case. You can't live in a home like this and not know what's going on. Which is why I say witnessing domestic violence is trauma to the child. So there's co-occurring abuse too, right? And this is what y'all might see. So to me, if an abuser is willing to abuse one person, if they're willing to show that they see people as property and not as people, then they don't care who they abuse. So obviously they're abusing the significant other and the kids. So this looks like half, right? 40 to 60 averages at half. So half of families who present with domestic violence also report child abuse from that same abuser. And here's where I was talking about that intervening being dangerous. One study found that half the children who were physically abused, they were physically abused because they got in the middle. They were trying to intervene on that attack and try to stop it. So, and we've got that psychological abuse using the kids though too. I don't know if y'all ever heard anything like this, but like there's an argument going on and one parent looks at the kids and says, am I being mean? And asks for that kind of validation. And, or holding the kids, not hostage, but holding the kids over the victim's head, kind of like, well, if you come back, you can see the kids again. we very commonly see threats to get the kids from school or daycare or grandma's or wherever it might be, and then just take off with the kids. You'll never see the kids again. And that one is really rough because there are some legal remedies, but they take some time. And particularly if they're married and there's nothing saying that the abuse, if the abuse is only occurring to the adult parent, there's really nothing stopping that offending parent from getting the kids from those locations, if you catch what I'm saying. So that one is very real and very, very difficult to navigate sometimes. And of course, we have seen plenty of calls to retaliatory calls to CPS, at which point, victim parent leaves with the kids, so offending parent calls CPS and says, oh, she's abusing the kids. And so at that point, we're like, you know what, just to comply with the investigation, like it's gonna be fine, just answer all the questions, and it always is fine. Oh, and I guess I skipped over that one. Threatening abuse against a child, right? If the adult isn't behaving, so to speak, for what the abuser wants. So like, they're holding up the 18-month by the leg and be like, I'm gonna drop them if you don't quit, and things like that. And I guess some reassurance, in my 5 years at Midcoast, I've never seen CPS take a woman's kids from her when they come to the shelter. This is actually later in the presentation, because that used to be a really contentious point with CPS, is that anytime there was domestic violence, they took the kids right away, and then they got more trauma training and more informed, and they realized actually it's a protective step. If the victim parent leaves the situation with the kids and goes to a shelter, that's actually a good thing. So we're going to leave the kids with that parent who's not abusing the kids. And so again, in a whole 5 years, I've never seen that happen. So that's something reassuring. If you come across that with birth parents, tell them, go ahead and leave. CPS isn't going to be a problem for you, unless there's, actual abuse going on to the kids. Okay, so some physical effects of domestic violence on children. So this is why, again, I say witnessing domestic violence is abuse to children, because they get the exact same symptoms as if they were being physically or sexually abused themselves, because they did experience the trauma. So they do get that same PTSD type of symptoms, which you guys may be familiar with, like that hypervigilance, which is just a fancy word for being very jumpy or anxious or fearful. They get those nightmares. They think about the abuse maybe a lot, and that a fancy word for that is rumination. That's like a thought that won't leave you alone. Some anxiety or depression, those are kind of two sides of the same coin. Because how that goes is, if you're really, really anxious all the time, then you get exhausted because you're anxious all the time, and then you get depressed. And then, you're anxious because you're depressed, and it's just kind of a not fun roller coaster. Or if you've got too many emotions, what happens is you get very detached and you shut off and become numb. So that's what that looks like too. And they might even feel some guilt or shame about that, especially if the abuser is using some of those tactics like, am I being mean? Or, mom didn't behave, so I'm not going to be able to see you for a while. Mom, things like that, if they're just using the kids. An effect of chronic stress is chronic health conditions. So your kids that you see in foster care are more likely going to have asthma and ADHD, or stomach problems more often, things like that. I'm sure y'all know that too. And of course, the school performance or school behavior issues, again, due to that chronic stress or being moved a lot as well. And how this carries on into later effects for the kids is that children who witness that domestic violence are more than twice as likely to then go on to be victims themselves later on of domestic violence. They see it, they repeat it. There's that hugely old saying that we marry our fathers, right? I mean, there is some truth to that. We go back to what's familiar, even if it's not safe, because familiar feels comfortable. So some emotional effects. We talked about physical effects. Here's some emotional effects. The maturity doesn't match their age. So either they've really regressed, they're really babyish, or they've had to be the parent in the family, and so they're really mature. Depends on your kid. Your victim caregiver is more stressed, so she's not really parenting that well or as much. Maybe your child is learning that love is conditional, or this is unstable, people can't be trusted. The actions don't match the words. That's very hard in parenting, right? If all these promises, it'll never happen again, I promise things are going to change, and then of course they don't, that's a rough lesson to be taught. And so kids are surviving any way they can, just like your foster kids are. And so they're learning manipulation, they're learning bad coping skills just to make it through the day. They might learn that nobody's going to provide food for me, so I'm going to have to steal it, or I'm going to have to hoard that food in my bedroom, or I'm going to have to eat in the middle of the night because nobody's going to feed me because they're too busy worrying about their own stuff, their own violence. And they're learning their own worth in a relationship. It is hard. I mean, we've already talked about why it is so difficult to leave a relationship, but if I'm a young girl and I'm living with my mom who is refusing to leave this relationship, then I'm being shown that I should stay in relationships like this, right? I mean, that is an unintended, unfortunate side effect. Kids are walking on eggshells just like the adults are, or maybe having to hide from the adults and things like that. Kids are being the protectors of other kids or the victim parent. Ooh, kids are not sure what to disclose, or they're asked to keep secrets, or the child is used to appease the abuser, like the victim parent uses the kid, like, hey, you know, go do something cute, just go sit with him, calm him down, things like that. And then of course, again, I'm certain you guys are familiar, but the kids are ultimately extremely confused because they don't, what we grow up with is what we grow up with, and that's our only experience. It's not like they know that this is unsafe or abnormal. For all they know, every family feels and looks like this, and so that's very confusing too. And also, why is anything wrong isn't an effective question, because for all they know, they're like, you know, no, this is family, right? And all this stuff is still from futureswithoutviolence.org. Okay, so how to remedy the effects from the same website. Of course, having a positive, healthy relationship with an adult, that is you. They spoke about intervening directly with children. So that was kind of knowing for law enforcement, when law enforcement respond to a call, kind of taking the time to sort of talk to the kid and say, hey, you know, this is not how parents act, and just really, really hammering home, like, this is not a safe thing. This is not how this is supposed to be. One thing I did over the summer that on a case that really made me uncomfortable, when mom took the kids to go back to the abuser, I looked those kids in the eye and I said, hey, you know, you guys can, because they were old enough, I was like, you can call us too. And that's very important to do. Like, if mom's not ready to get help, okay, but the kids have a safe place also. And of course, they may need some counseling and education about what a healthy relationship looks like, so that they're exposed to what that looks like too. But just really being proactive, like with the kids in the shelter, we try to really just educate everybody that comes in, because just as they always say, kids can't report abuse if they don't know what abuse is. Same thing with domestic violence. So safety planning with kids. So this might be somebody who has not left the relationship, or a relationship where maybe they have left, but there's a lot of stalking going on. They might not be safe. Like, what do you do if you run into this person at HEB? So establish some code words, but then establish what you're going to do after those code words. I made that mistake once. Somebody gave me a code word and I was like, great, I don't know what to do to help you though. You said the code word and I don't know what to do. And then practice that. And so what that might look like is, if we see the abuser at HEB, then we're going to say scrambled eggs, and then, you know, we know we're going to leave right away. Meet at the front of the store, leave right away. Establish who the safe relatives are. Grandma may not be a safe person to visit or talk to, or if grandma tries to pick her up from school, that might not be okay right now if it's, you know, if it's the abuser's mom. So tell those things to the kids. And alternately, talk about what not to disclose. Maybe my 12-year-old child needs to know that we are, you know, we can't tell anybody that we're moving. We can't tell anybody that we have a new phone number. And of course, everybody's going to have to just know the maturity of the child and if they can handle that sort of secret keeping or things, or if they just need to not tell the child. So have plans for those different situations and code words. What happens if you know, establish who's okay to pick you up from school. What happens if someone else tries? What do you do? And then of course teach kids how to call 911, or a safe place to go, like if they're still living in the home, a safe place they could stay during an attack of violence, you know, if they hide behind the couch or whatever. Y'all are probably familiar with the ACE questionnaire. Oh, yeah, okay, I figured. I was like, we're required to give it to our kids when they move in. So like our foster kids, not our shelter kids. Okay, so the thing I love about the ACE questionnaire is it does not ask the vocabulary words, it asks the definitions. And I love that because like we said earlier about strangulation, if I ask somebody, have you been strangled? She's gonna tell me no, probably. If I ask, has he ever put his hands around your neck? Then she may say, oh yes, that has happened. And so for kids, it's kind of the same thing. Has there been any contact in any areas on your body covered by a bathing suit, rather than maybe sexual abuse or things like that? I actually do that with the adults too. There's a separate question about sexual abuse on the adults within that relationship, and I always ask, did he ever make you do anything sexually you didn't want to do? Because they will disclose that, but they won't disclose sexual assault. So I mean, it's just that's another defense mechanism our brains have. Like it's not as big of a deal to confront, oh yeah, I had to do something sexually I didn't want to do, as it is to say, oh yes, I was sexually assaulted. Like those are two different weights of a sentence. And so I love that about the ACE questionnaire, that it asks the definitions. Okay, or they might simply not know what it means. Might not know what sexual abuse is or strangulation. So here's where I was talking about earlier about the relationship between domestic violence and CPS. So I'm talking like the 1980s. When I first started at Midcoast, some of this myth kind of still lingered, like we would still get women that asked about that. But thankfully, I actually haven't, this really isn't a fear anymore, that they're going to get their kids taken away because they went to the shelter. But if you happen to have the last straggling person who fears that, just squash that fear for them. It's totally different now. Like I said, 5 whole years, I've never once seen that happen. Okay, so what do we see at the shelter? As far as the victim parent, we see where like the victim parent has just really been broken down. She has such low self-esteem or so much anxiety that she's really not effectively parenting, and the kids are running all over her. But the kids are also having their own trauma reaction, which means they're hyper and out of control just on their own because they've been through trauma also. And invariably, the moms feel like they're the only ones having that problem, though. They feel like they're such bad parents. They feel really isolated in that problem. They feel like only they are doing a bad job, even though they're not. Everybody's surviving, right? And she kept them safe. So, I mean, that's the best thing you can do, keep your kids safe. She's usually blaming herself for any abuse that may have occurred to the kids or whatever they witnessed. And she believes very, very strongly the insults the abuser told her. Like he's probably told her some things about her being a bad parent or things like that. And her support system has been cut off, which is really hard. So the kids haven't been going to grandma's to give her a break. The kids haven't been going to aunt and uncles to give them a break. But always, she is seeing herself way worse than the situation actually is. And so that's kind of a process for us as far as parenting support groups and just counseling itself to help build her back up and realize like, no, she's got this. And like, you've been told a lot of lies, and I know you believe them really strongly right now, but they are lies, and you can do this. From the kids' side, I've seen a lot of teens that unfortunately they are upset with the victim parent for making them having to go live at the shelter. They don't like that. They feel very shameful about that. I have seen teens blame the victim parent for the abuse. And again, that's awful. And so we just kind of try to work through that also and explain healthy relationships. And this was the right decision, even though it is hard, it was the right decision. We've, of course, I mean, y'all see this too. Oldest child is the one actually parenting, right? See that a lot. Kids have trauma symptoms, low self-esteem. I was actually surprised about how far behind grade level or skill level some of the kids are. Like I can one time there was a mom trying to meet with the case manager, and the little 4-year-old was outside the office sort of making some noise and stuff. So finally I pulled her in my office and I was like, let's color while mom visits. And she didn't know her colors, and that she was way too old to not know her colors. I'm like, oh my goodness. And so that's why we have a child advocate too, to kind of do some of that education. But I mean, that's just not happening. You know, if people aren't parenting their kids, they aren't hitting those milestones like that. And if, well, yeah, kind of talked about co-occurring abuse. Okay, so what do we do to help? Of course, we have the parent support group, one-on-one support. We do model parenting skills, because we also have a lot of moms that have aged out of foster care and don't have those skills. So we're never mean about it. We're just like, hey, here's a way to do this. Okay, some examples of that. Parenting breaks, we have those too. So we will babysit the kids while mom is on site, just so she can have a little break. That's helpful, right? Every parent needs that. And of course, visiting with the teens and the kids directly about the abuse and their response to it. But yeah, so I already said this one, but our moms are often out of foster care themselves. So we extend the same compassion, right? I think I saw a meme or something like that once about birth parents being probably the exact same kids we would have loved to welcome into our home 15 years ago. And so extending that same compassion to them. So we really try to live by that too. So if you want any more information on domestic violence, these are the places that I got information from. I'm looking at the bottom one. loveisrespect.org is specific to teen domestic violence, and never underestimate the lethality of teen violence. I just want to put that out there, because again, those cases in California where they discovered that strangulation is the red flag, both of those were teenagers that were killed. I think they were 16 and 17. And every year in Texas, there are teenagers killed by domestic violence. And for more info on foster care or trauma in general, I really love The Connected Child by Dr. Karen Purvis, who is a Texan, or was a Texan. And TBRI, Trust-Based Relational Intervention, that's we don't use that like hardcore at the shelter, but that's something we try to use. It's parenting techniques developed specifically for children from hard places, as she called it. But it just means children who have been through trauma. And if you don't want to invest in the books, there's a whole YouTube channel about it. And then trauma in general, how it affects people long-term, The Body Keeps the Score, is an absolutely incredible book. Kind of reads like a textbook though. So I don't know, just read a few pages a day, but it's extremely in-depth and extremely cool. And that's my info, if you'll have any questions or anything. And that's it for me. I guess I'll leave that one up there in case anybody needs it.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was great.
Thank y'all.
Does anybody have any questions or anything right now?
Elizabeth,
Yes, ma'am. Are you, go ahead. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Was there a question?
I didn't know if somebody else was trying to ask.
Oh,
How many times does the victim leave before she actually leaves her? And I say she because, you know.
Right.
How many times does it take for a victim to leave, or how many times does
The statistic I saw on that one most recently, and I'm pretty sure it's the national hotline website. I'm trying to find the websites again. I don't know where they went, but the statistic I saw most recently was it's an average of 7 times, which feels like a lot, but I mean, yeah, it's 7 times. Hard to get out.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
In the case where the victim has a strong marriage, like her marriage vows are important to her, do y'all counsel for them to just to get away but stay safe, but maybe try and get the husband or the abuser, whichever the case is, to get help before just moving straight forward to you need to get a divorce?
So how they do, I mean, well, with anybody in their religion, I mean, ultimately everything's always up to the survivor, and we would never try to convince anybody of anything. I mean, I would share my concerns. I would say, hey, I really am worried about your safety in this, but I'm never going to be like, no, you need to leave him, or you know, anything as strong as that. How I have counseled, like for example, very strong Catholic clients is, and Father Gary Yannick, who does the counseling for the Emmaus Center, you know, one of the counselors over there, and I've heard he has said the same thing, so that makes me feel really good too. But he has said, we say things like, this isn't what you agreed to in the marriage contract, like this wasn't in the vows, and so he's broken his part of the deal. And so that's kind of how we approach that. As far as from the counseling side, they don't recommend like any type of marriage counseling or anything like that, that for domestic violence. What they recommend instead is that the abuser attend what's called BIP. It's called Batter Intervention and Prevention. What's the second P? Program? I don't know. Letitia, what's the second P?
Right.
And so that specific program is a lot more effective. And we have seen that where the batter will attend BIP. The problem with that is BIP has to usually either be CPS ordered or court ordered. Like, I don't know how many abusers you know that are like, oh yeah, I think I'm an abuser. I think I'm just gonna go take this class because you said so. I mean, you know,
Right.
so that's a harder avenue. But so yes, if they really want to preserve the marriage and they can do it safely, then send her to counseling and send him to BIP.
Mhm.
That was a good question. And that's not me saying that. That's like, you can Google that.
Wow, this was great information. Anyone else have any questions for Elizabeth? Elizabeth, may we contact you if we do have questions in the future?
Oh yeah, of course.
That's
Of course.
wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank y'all.
Well, thank you for joining us today.